On Capitol Hill, the clash between former President Trump and the congressional committee investigating the January 6th insurrection is heating up. The former president is now suing to try and stop the National Archives from handing over documents related to the attack. This comes as the committee prepares to vote to recommend a former top Trump advisor be held in criminal contempt. NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalas is here to help us break it all down. Danny, let's start with the former president's lawsuit. This was filed yesterday. What exactly is he claiming here?
The president procedurally has to sue not the Biden administration, but the National Archives. And that's because the Presidential Records Act takes all of those records, that's logs, all the information from Trump's White House era, and transfers them to the National Archives. So Trump correctly is suing the National Archives because they are the caretaker of the information. But now that he is no longer the president, his power to prevent disclosure of those records diminishes significantly, and he has to seek that injunction. And the Biden administration does have some say, arguably a greater say than the former president, in deciding whether or not those documents and records are ultimately released.
So executive privilege seems to be key. You said there that it diminishes, but I guess not necessarily disappears. Explain to us how that usually works when a president is no longer in office. Have any past presidents been able to retroactively protect documents?
So Trump has basically two arguments in the privilege front. One is attorney-client privilege, and the other is executive privilege. And a series of cases from back in the 70s called Nixon 1 and Nixon 2, and you can guess which president that involved, dealt with, or at least announced the existence of executive privilege. In other words, we know what it is, we know it exists, but we don't really know the contours of it, even today. And there have been cases along the way that have chipped out or defined or clarified further what executive privilege is, but not in every single situation. So Trump, the other Nixon case, Nixon 2, tells us that Trump, as an ex-president, has the power to assert executive privilege, but to what degree is still undefined. And arguably, President Biden has the ability to veto it, in a sense, to trump it, pun intended, pun not intended, Trump's own claim of executive privilege.
Okay, so let's talk about someone else involved or tied to all of this, Steve Bannon, former Trump advisor. He is in the crosshairs, if you will, of the January 6th committee. What can you tell us about the votes scheduled for later today and the legal jeopardy that Bannon is facing?
From the outset, Congress signaled that this situation, subpoenaing folks like Bannon and other former Trump orbit folks, would be different. We're going to issue subpoenas right away. We're getting these documents. But as time rolls on, it's really like it is almost every other time Congress has sought to subpoena documents from the unwilling, whether the witnesses themselves don't want to produce it, or in this case, President Trump ostensibly is refusing to let Steve Bannon disclose that information. The challenge is that Congress clearly has this broad authority to issue subpoenas and gather information. But when the rubber hits the road, Congress doesn't appear to have the actual power to enforce those subpoenas. Yes, it has a sergeant of arms that can send out and arrest these people, but that's not a practical or really reasonable way to get the information. So, as is normally the case, this starts out with a lot of fanfare, ends with a lot of negotiation.
All right. Well, we will keep an eye on the fanfare and the negotiations. Danny Savalas, thank you so much for that.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.